everybody, I'm JD Shepard and welcome to my Comm 70 final project on the Happiness Playbook Podcast. Have you ever heard of the saying that when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade? Well, making lemonade is what LaRee Florence does best. LaRee is the founder and artistic director of Take Note Troop, a local youth organization that inspires Sacramento youth to change the world one good deed at a time. So how do you inspire a bunch of teens to think so big and so outside of themselves? You give them an avenue to practice the happiness skills that they learn. In Take Note Troop, for instance, that avenue is theater. LaRee teaches these youth that happiness is a skill and has packaged that idea by dividing happiness into 4 key principles that these youth practice through theater. These 4 principles are 1, be present. 2, let go and play. 3, accept and build. And 4, look outward. The youth in this organization would take these principles and practice them in theater productions such as Twelfth Night, Comedy of Errors, Taming of the Shrew, and Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. The kids would then teach the play theory principles in workshops to local schools, other youth organizations such as Koinonia and Loomis, and even businesses. The service organization has changed the lives of thousands of kids, my own being some of them. But when COVID-19 hit last year, life threw a lemon at LaRee's mission of teaching the world the skills to happiness. So what did she do? She made lemonade out of those lemons and discovered a new way to take her message out to the world in a bigger and better way through developing the Happiness Playbook Podcast. I had the privilege of interviewing LaRee to discover more about her role as producer of the Happiness Playbook Podcast. But before I delve into that, let me explain what a podcast is. A podcast is a digital audio file that is made available on the internet for listening and downloading. The podcasts have a hosting site, the most popular in America being Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Podcasts are like a TV show. They have an overarching concept that make up a series. The series is then broken down into smaller episodes. New episodes are usually made available to subscribers on a weekly basis. The Happiness Playbook Podcast has content revolving around the idea that happiness is a team sport. It explores the true origins of happiness in order to make the listener into better team players in the game of life. The weekly episodes are hosted by Neil Hooper. The person responsible for the content, however, is LaRee Florence herself. LaRee spends about 3 hours looking for applicable content for Neil to share a week. But just like happiness is a team sport, so is creating a podcast. LaRee readily admits that Neil is working just as hard as she is behind the scenes in order to make their podcast full of rich and applicable content for listeners. Neil and LaRee also enlist other teammates into their podcast by having special guests that Neil interviews. They also direct listeners to places where they can learn more, such as YouTube and even other podcasts. In other words, LaRee is practicing what she preaches by saying good things are usually possible because of the team around you. The Happiness Playbook has been able to take LaRee's message to get a bigger audience than just the local youth around Sacramento. Unfortunately, one of the challenges with the podcast is that it's hard to tell exactly how many people are benefiting from your content. There is not a way to streamline the analytics of each podcast hosting site into one database. In order to collect data on which listeners are responding to, LaRee has to look at things such as individual listener feedback or comments. She can see how many people have downloaded each episode, but that doesn't really tell how many people listen to the episodes that didn't get downloaded. I mean, I've never downloaded an episode I've listened to on a podcast, and I have listened to hundreds of series. So I've never been counted as a listener to any podcasts, even though I've listened to hundreds of episodes of those podcasts. This is a real problem for LaRee and Neil because they are left guessing how effectively their message is being received. Another difficult thing about having a podcast is that it takes money. As of now, the Happiness Playbook podcast has yet to generate any revenue. That doesn't mean that revenue won't eventually be generated in large amounts from the podcast. The podcasts give you notoriety and viewers. And Neil and LaRee hope to have a book that they will be publishing regarding the principles taught in the Happiness Playbook podcast. Another way to monetize with a podcast is by having advertisers. The negative part of advertisers is that they take up airtime, and they sometimes distract from the message of the podcast. So, they are also hard to get. By taking the podcast to YouTube, it is easier to get advertisers because YouTube does the work for you. By advertising for you, by stopping the video and playing advertiser ads. This is why so many podcasters also deliver their message via YouTube. Despite the challenges of monetizing a podcast and keeping the content relevant and applicable, having a podcast like the Happiness Playbook podcast that is benefiting people's lives makes the podcast rewarding in ways far more important than money. LaRee has received feedback that certain episodes have changed the way parents parent their children. She spoke of a few instances where parents have said that they are better suited for the challenges of COVID-19 parenting because of the content of the Happiness Playbook podcast. Another mom with special needs children said that the Happiness Playbook podcast has given her a new perspective and it's helped her carry the weight of her responsibilities. Because LaRee Florence cares about changing the world, even one good deed at a time. This kind of feedback is what motivates her to keep pushing forward in the mission of the Happiness Playbook podcast. I, for one, never knew that feedback and comments meant so much. It seems like such a little thing for listeners to do. My interview with LaRee Florence reiterated her idea that small acts of kindness make a difference in people's lives. Happiness is a team sport, and we need to help each other and cheer each other on in an effort to make the world a better place. People like LaRee are working hard with little appreciation for their efforts. This is how it is for many people in the communications industry. But big success is born from big effort, and I see great things in store for the Happiness Playbook podcast. Thanks for listening.